All right, well, good afternoon, class. I hope that by this point everybody's made it home safe and sound and that you're not having to travel on these icy roads or anything, and that you can just stay at home and kick back, watch some Netflix, and stay at the house. But I wanted to do a brief overview of Chapter 5. By now you should have already done your quiz for Chapter 5. And so I'll be reiterating some of the topics discussed in the quiz during this presentation. But since we weren't able to meet today in person, originally I did have several activities that were going to accompany this lesson, but I'll just go ahead and give you kind of a brief overview of what we would have been doing in the lesson. So up to this point, we've talked about an overview of the extension system. We've talked about the history of extension. We've also looked at the organizational structure of the extension system, and we've also looked at each of the program areas associated with extension. So looking specifically at 4-H and youth development, ag and natural resources, family and consumer sciences, and community development. And so now we're looking at it more from an educator's perspective, looking specifically at program planning and program development. So real briefly, this is just an overview of what we'll be talking about, the definition of a program, the people that are involved in the program planning process, factors that influence program development, then design and implementation, evaluation, people involved in the program planning process, program management strategies, communication plans, and also interdisciplinary program planning and ethical issues and programming pitfalls to avoid. So the text focuses on a basic program developmental model composed of three components: planning, design and implementation, and evaluation. And so throughout the presentation, I'll be focusing on everything through this three-component model, but I'll also allude to some other models that are used within extension and education. So when defining what a program is, the text defines it as referring to the product resulting from all activities in which a professional educator and learner are involved. And so in the example they give, rather than focusing on a single activity such as a cornfield day, they say that this may not be sufficient, this one interaction, to help a farmer change their tillage practices. And if we really want to implement this change and see a change in behaviors, we need to look at a series of activities, or what they define as a program. So in combination, using field days, seminars, dialogue among other farmers, resources such as computer programs, and also publications about equipment for minimum tillage, all of these things linked together may be possible in achieving the intended results and seeing those behavior changes. So with that, program planning then is a process designed to bring about effective programming. And in the text, in a lot of places, you'll see it used synonymously with the term program development. So either program planning, program development, essentially the same thing. But the program planning process includes identification of needs, planning, instruction, program promotion, evaluation, and reporting. So we'll talk about each of these in more detail within that three-component model. So speaking of other models, one that I like to refer to that breaks it down a little bit more is one from Etling and Maloney, and they break it down as 7 essential steps to follow when planning a program. And so specifically, they look at identifying issues, determining needs, setting goals and objectives, assessing resources, forming a plan, implementing the plan, and evaluating the results. And so we'll talk about each of these in more detail. So I really like this diagram from the text that gives a good visual representation of everything that we'll be talking about within this chapter. So as the extension professional and looking at our little three-component model, we first have to start with planning. So we're identifying our goals for the program. We conduct a needs assessment, so we are trying to determine what needs there are in our county as far as programming development goes. Once we've identified those needs within the county for our programs, we need to prioritize those needs. We need to identify the target audiences who will be the recipients of those programs. And we also want to write program objectives, so how we want to attain our goals. And after the planning phase, we move into the design and implementation phase. We know what programs we're going to deliver. We know what audiences we're going to target to. So now we need to select and develop content. We need to decide what delivery methods and resource materials we're going to use. So if we're using existing resource materials or if we need to create our own. And also constructing an implementation timeline. So we're planning everything. We go through that where we design our programs, we implement our programs, and then the final phase is evaluation, where after we have planned, we've designed, we've conducted our program, we have to evaluate everything that we did to measure program success and impact, and see if the program that we conducted has made an impact, if we've had effective outcomes, if we've created intended changes or changes in behavior. So basically seeing what our program did and if it was worth continuing. We also have several external factors that influence our program developing interests. So from a personal standpoint, as the extension educator, we all have our own personal interests and expertise that we bring to the table that can influence our program planning decisions. There's also the needs of the community and society as a whole, and so we'll be talking more specifically about some of the factors that influence our program development. And then lastly, there's also the organizational context to take into consideration. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the land-grant philosophy, which we've already alluded to in some of our previous lessons, as well as the organizational structure within Extension. So speaking of which, looking at our specific organizational context, we know that planning begins with the organization's mission, visions, and values. And so as we've talked about in some of our other lessons with Extension's philosophy, we have a focus on providing practical knowledge. We have a link directly to research and to research-based information. We use a hands-on approach, and we conduct programming in a non-formal setting. So tailoring our programming efforts to reflect this extension philosophy. We also know, we've also talked briefly about our organizational structure and how this impacts our program planning. So looking again at our programming at the federal, state, and local levels, we know that direction for programming efforts can be made at both the federal and the state level, and those can then influence our local or county programming efforts. At the federal level, USDA NIFA requires each state to develop a 5-year plan of work, and so annually those states are accountable for reporting on their accomplishments, and each of the educators within counties within a state are responsible for reporting on their accomplishments, which are then compiled into state reports. All right, so first we're going to talk about the planning phase of our program development model. And so when we look at people in the program planning process, there are two key groups that we look at, the guidance team and the stakeholders. And stakeholders are the people who have a vested interest in the program. So these can be the people that we are conducting the program for. They might be people who are our partners in delivering the program. They might be on an advisory board or committee within the extension organization, and they have a vested interest in the outcome of this program, or perhaps they're the ones who suggested that this program be conducted. So giving a more visual representation of some of the stakeholders that we can have for our educational programs, that can be influenced by our funding sources, potential clients, and taxpayers, so that could include anybody within the county, program managers, advisory groups, boards, volunteers are a big one, supervisors, and then also other staff, which can include personnel that are also in the extension office. So the next phase within this program planning phase is conducting a needs assessment. And so as extension educators, we are continually challenged to identify programs that are relevant to the concerns of people. So looking at our extension philosophy, we're considered the people's university, and it is our mission to take the research-based information that the university creates and disseminate it to the people within our individual counties. And so it's the educator's responsibility to work with those key stakeholders in their county to identify and prioritize the needs of learners and decide how best to allocate resources such as time, money, energy, and personnel to achieve maximum results. And so a needs assessment is defined as the systematic process of analyzing gaps between what learners know and what they should know and can do. So looking specifically at what we already know and what we can know or what we can achieve. So needs assessments can help educators by improving our accessibility of programs. They can help us to learn more about present conditions in a community, especially if you're a new educator and are coming into a new county that you're not familiar with, or even in my case, coming to a new state where I didn't know any people in the county. I wasn't aware of the organizational context, and so this is a great opportunity to learn more about the county. Also learning more about their specific needs within communities in the county. Also identifying possibilities to develop new programs or expand existing ones. Addressing public opinion about goals and priorities, and also building interest in community programs or public decisions, because this is an opportunity to interact with folks out in the different communities in your county and get to know what their programming needs and interests are. So there are 5 categories of needs assessment methods that we typically use. The one that everybody's most familiar with is survey methods. And surveys can be conducted in person, on the phone. A lot of times nowadays they are also distributed via online or sent through an email link. So here at OSU we typically use Qualtrics. You guys might have also seen things from like SurveyMonkey. I think there's also Google surveys. So an easy, efficient way to disseminate surveys. But then again, there's also the good old paper copy, which we can mail, we can distribute at meetings, and so forth. Another type of needs assessment method is social indicators, and these are demographic or statistical data that describes the size and characteristics of population groups. So we can look at this demographic or statistical data for our county to try to get a quantitative measure of what some of the needs are within our county. There's also group processes, which directly involves our stakeholders, and this can include public hearings, advisory groups, task forces, and focus groups. And I'll show some specific examples from some of my program advisory committee meetings that I would have to conduct, where I was conducting a needs assessment with a lot of our key stakeholders. There's also future focus methods, which is used specifically for long range or strategic planning. Some specific methods within that are using a futures wheel, scenario building, using a decision tree. They also say simulation and games, the Delphi technique, cross-impact analysis, and also trend extrapolation. And then lastly, causal analysis, which is used to look beyond needs to analyze the causes. And this helps the educator to avoid making incorrect assumptions or conclusions, so kind of forecasting into the future. So this is an example from a program advisory committee that I had to conduct. Within the county, since I had a split appointment and had program priority areas in ag as well as 4-H and youth development, we would have to conduct these program advisory committee meetings for each of our respective disciplines. And so at least once a year I would conduct one for ag and one for 4-H. And so this is a list of all of the folks that were on my program advisory committee. So they represented lots of different organizations within the county. Some were farmers, some were cattle producers, some worked in governmental agencies such as USDA FSA, the NRCS, Farm Credit. We also had the mayor of Guthrie, This is really cool. We had one of our local senators, and being close enough to Oklahoma City, she was actually usually able to come to our meetings and provide a lot of awesome input. And then we also had some folks, being pretty close to campus, I would also try to have some folks from OSU and also some of our district and area specialists. And so each year I would send out letters to each of these stakeholders, and I would invite them to attend a focus group session. And so depending on how many people were actually able to come to the meeting, I would also send out a program survey to folks who were on the advisory committee but maybe weren't able to come to the meeting. And I would ask them to rank priority areas that they saw. So we would look specifically at priority areas that had been identified in the past, and ask them to rank if they thought that those were still important. And then also identify if they had any new priority issues that they saw. And so these are a few examples. This is from the in-person meeting of some of the priority areas or issues that were identified that folks in the county saw as priorities for programming. So you can see feral hogs, cedar tree control was always a big one, so having education on that, looking at identification of trees and the impact that those have on the terrain. Also looking at controlled burning, oil field activity was a big one, pertaining to drilling mud, water conservation, looking at pasture longevity. At the time that I conducted this meeting, the Farm Bill was a really big topic, and so folks were wanting information pertaining to the Farm Bill, and also rural economic development. And so after the meeting, we had to prioritize our needs that were identified, and so this is specifically for the Community Resource and Economic Development Initiative. And specifically within that, some of the big issues that were identified were related to water conservation, specifically in communities and small acreages, where we were seeing a lot of runoff, especially pertaining to folks applying pesticides and herbicides and insecticides to their lawns, and we were seeing runoff from that. Master gardener trainings, wildfire prevention and education, as well as controlled burning education was another big one. Again, Farm Bill education was big, and also community garden development. And so in addition to identifying those important issues, we also had to brainstorm major actions as to how we would address those concerns. And we would also list resource people who would serve as direct contacts for working in that particular initiative area. So the next phase in our planning process is setting program priorities. And sometimes we can identify needs without a clear picture of their relative importance or ranking. So we identify these needs, but we don't really see the whole picture of how they fit into our program development process. And so it's really important to prioritize our needs because we are just one person, and there's only so much educational programming that we can do within a year. And so it's really important to focus on the biggest programming priority areas first. Some big reasons for priority setting. The first one is to help direct program action to the changing needs of the people, to help us work proactively to prevent future problems or crises, so working proactively. Important for establishing credibility and accountability with program stakeholders. A big one is that the job of the extension professional is easier if priorities are established, and we're not just kind of aimlessly working on all these different programs and projects at the same time without a clear sense of direction. And additionally, it helps with allocating resources at the local, state, and federal levels and being accountable for those resources. So the next phase in the planning process is to identify our target audiences and capabilities. And so you might think, why don't we just design these generic programs that we can use with anyone and everyone and just have this packaged product that we can just roll out to anybody? The reason that we don't do that is that within each county, and after conducting our needs assessment, we realize that everybody has different needs and wants. So focusing on their age, their educational level, their socioeconomic status, language, ethnicity, cultural patterns, all these different variables that come into consideration. So it's important that when we are planning our programs, we tailor them specifically to the people that we will be serving. Educational programs will address the needs of individuals more effectively when they're designed with the specific audience in mind. So the next phase is developing measurable objectives. Measurable objectives are used to provide direction for a program. And I'm sure you guys have heard about writing SMART objectives. And I'm sure by this point you've probably written SMART goals, you've written SMART objectives. And so looking specifically at each of the letters and what they stand for, excuse me, S stands for the specific outcomes that we're hoping to attain. So it indicates what the learner will do, what those specific outcomes will do. The M stands for the specific outcome to be measured. So whatever it is that we are trying to, whatever our goal is, I should say, we want it to be measurable. So to what degree will the learner achieve the outcome? So A stands for achievable or attainable. And so we want to look specifically if it's reasonable to believe that success can be achieved or attained for the objective, and that we're not, shooting for these super lofty goals that are unattainable. The R stands for relevant, so asking ourselves if conditions will really improve if the learners achieve the objective. Is what they're learning really relevant to the specific individuals? Excuse me, got a tickle in my throat. And then T is that the objective must be accomplished within a specified time frame. And so, for example, we might say that after 1 year, the average household income of all farmers joining a coffee cooperative will increase by 15% as determined by a comparison of income at the beginning and ending of the year. So it's specific, it's measurable, the goal is achievable or attainable, the objective is relevant, and they've also specified a specific time frame.